If your government creates a mandate, a requirement of you and all other citizens that you must eat a hot dog every Sunday, and let's say that you oppose this mandate, perhaps you prefer to eat your hot dogs on a Friday. Sunday just doesn't fit your hot dog schedule. So you say no. Are you anti-hot dog, or are you just anti-mandate? Well, given that a mandate is a policy position that has no inherent association with sausages or buns, it would be absurd to imply that a position against government-mandated hot dogs is akin to being anti-hot dog in and of itself, right? Well, it's a little more complicated than that. Together, you and I are going to explore the evolution of the English language and the treacherous intersection that is language and politics. Hopefully, I will show you how intertwined everything is and why, in many cases, political discourse is seemingly doomed from the start. Full disclosure, I'm not a linguist by trade, so if I make any errors along the way, I defer to the experts. Everything is open for discussion, so let's begin. In 2020, the political debate around vaccine efficacy was in full swing. Like many others, I did my best to keep up with the news in the hopes of nurturing something of an informed opinion. I was vaccinated, boosted, and followed the rules somewhat begrudgingly at times. However, as someone who enjoys a robust discussion, I increasingly noticed what I considered to be bad faith misrepresentations of people with legitimate concerns regarding the vaccine and/or the mandates. Media reports on people opposing the mandate itself, regardless of the grounds for the opposition of the mandate, were being described as anti-vaxxers. That is to say, media reports were equating people who are opposed to a government mandate as anti-vaccine generally. One more time, the media says that if you don't want to eat your mandated hot dog every Sunday, it's only because you hate hot dogs. And to be clear, I'm not arguing for or against mandates, I'm just highlighting the fact that these definitions are collapsing in on themselves. But why would the media obscure the truth like this? Are the media even to blame? Let's take a look. Merriam-Webster. Anti-vaxxer. Noun. A person who opposes the use of some or all vaccines, regulations mandating vaccination, or usually both. There it is, opposes regulations mandating vaccination. So the source of the obfuscation appears to be the dictionary itself. But why would the dictionary obscure the truth like this? Are dictionaries to blame? Not necessarily. They play a role in legitimizing and propagating these definitions, but they're not a singular causal factor by any means. Let's dig a little deeper. We all know how a dictionary works. What isn't so commonly known is that there are two primary mechanisms that contribute to the acceptance of a word into the public lexicon, so to speak. There is what's called a prescriptive mechanism and a descriptive mechanism. Up until the 1900s, dictionaries maintained a predominantly prescriptive methodology. A definition would be prescribed, and we the people would use the word accordingly. Consider the word literally. Once upon a time, this word literally meant one thing and one thing only. The definition was prescriptive, literally meant in a literal sense, not metaphorical. In the 20th century, social movements against classism and elitism, for example, gained traction. Barriers were broken, and the pace of linguistic evolution picked up, facilitating further social progress, such as the acknowledgement of regional and dialectical differences in slang, etc. In essence, people were given the power to decide what words meant for themselves, and the dictionaries listened, culminating in the publication of Webster's Third in 1961. This publication was particularly controversial, as it sealed the departure from traditional prescriptivism, ushering in a new era of descriptive dominance that maintains to this day. Today, literally also has a descriptive definition, akin to metaphorically. Broadly speaking, literally and anti-vaxxer both demonstrate linguistic evolution via the descriptive mechanism. But here's where it gets interesting. One of these descriptive definitions is organic, the other strongly indicates an element of political seeding. We'll touch again on this shortly. For the record, the descriptive definition of literally is nothing new. Shakespeare did it as well, but it's a familiar example that illustrates the at times relative harmlessness of descriptivism. So, what's the problem? Well, descriptivism tells us that regardless of how logically inconsistent it is, no matter how insane it might sound, whatever the circumstances are, if you eat that damned hot dog on Friday and enough people have a problem with it, you will be considered anti-hot dog in Merriam-Webster's next publication. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the difference between organic evolution, the word literally, and politically motivated evolution, anti-mandate being equivocated with a stance on the subject of the policy. Words like literally evolved through widespread recreational use. In the case of literally itself, often for embellishing stories. But words or compound words like anti-vaxxer are recalibrated, ultimately stifling political discussion by removing all nuance. Why entertain a nuanced discussion on mandates if you can just simply imply that someone hates science? The unfortunate reality is that being reductive is politically expedient, and I really don't like it. And whilst I understand and appreciate the positive role that descriptivism has played in the past, given the inherent vulnerabilities of descriptivism, the new age of social media and disinformation, I'd argue that language is open to exploitation now more than ever. So where to from here? I don't think the solution is to gatekeep others. Some things are outside of your control. Younger generations are increasingly online, meaning the predominant source of their politics are verbal, descriptive takes from other people online. The online discussion has few guardrails, and the incentives are not truth-seeking but attention-seeking. Clarity was never available to them like it was in the past. In any case, we all use a mixture of prescriptivism and descriptivism in our daily lives. When you're writing, you're generally more prescriptive. When you're verbal, you're generally more descriptive. And whilst you can't gatekeep others, you can certainly gatekeep yourself. My advice is to approach politics with a prescriptive lens and avoid being dragged into nonsensical discussions with people who don't speak the same dialect as you. Use your newfound understanding of descriptive language to assess whether a politician's comments are beneficial or detrimental to social progress. Allow me to elaborate. I'm going to give a controversial example to illustrate why prescriptivism is so important to our political future. I'm going to argue that prescriptivism is the path to truth and the only rigid path to social cohesion. I'm going to argue that descriptivism destroys clarity and is misinterpreted as a shortcut to social cohesion, which ultimately leads to a low-trust society. But first, I need to say a few things about Islam. First and foremost, and I'd recommend this to everyone, try to avoid using Islam and Muslims interchangeably. It's a common mistake, but an easy one to avoid if you just remember the difference. Islam is an ideology. People will interpret Islam differently, but it remains an ideology nonetheless. Muslims are people. You'll have Muslims who feel a sentimental attachment to the Muslim label, but love and respect Western liberty. Or perhaps they have Middle Eastern heritage and would appreciate the clarification. If we don't offer our criticisms carefully, we risk alienating the secular, reasonable, or otherwise socially cohesive members of our society. Some conversations are uncomfortable, but they're important if we're going to live in a multicultural society outside of an Orwellian nightmare. Thus, it is important to avoid any unforced errors. Now on to the example. In November 2025, Australian Senator Pauline Hanson wore a burqa to the Senate chamber as a form of protest over the religious garment. Hanson was suspended, censured, and criticised by some of her political opponents. Fatima Payman, another Australian senator, suggested that this move was disrespectful. Mehreen Faruqi, another Australian senator, suggested that this move was blatant racism. Payman has accused Hanson of racism in the past, but I want to discuss this particular situation as a standalone example. With that in mind, I have no major qualms with Payman here. There could be an argument that Hanson's approach is unnecessarily irreverent. I don't particularly care for that argument, but I can't tell Payman how to feel, and her position isn't necessarily outside the realm of discussion. So Payman gets a pass from me here, because disrespectful isn't so loaded of a term that the conversation cannot continue. Faruqi's comments, on the other hand, are disappointing to say the least. So disappointing that I want to reiterate this. Hanson wore a burqa. Faruqi decided that the person wearing the burqa was racist. Ask yourself, would Faruqi have called Hanson racist if Hanson was of any other racial background? Doubtful. Hanson's racial background appears to be a key determining factor in Faruqi's conclusion that pulling the racism card would be effective and appropriate in the first place. Ironic, unproductive, worst of all, detrimental to social cohesion. Imagine that you are a secular Muslim, enjoying a new life in Australia. Imagine that you don't like the burqa for whatever reason. That's allowed. Now imagine watching an Australian senator calling a fellow Australian racist publicly for criticising the burqa. Is anyone allowed to criticise the burqa? I would argue that a significant amount of pushback that we're seeing towards Islam isn't necessarily because of the prevailing faults of Islam itself, but our inability to discuss these faults without fear of reprisal. That's why social cohesion is suffering. Bad faith politicians create division and skepticism amongst us. Clarity is irrelevant, progress is irrelevant, truth is irrelevant. Sadly, if there are any victims of oppression based on archaic cultural practices, politicians like Faruqi will do their best to stop you from ever reaching those victims. Finally, let's have a look at the UK. Tens of thousands of arrests in recent years have involved communications offences, including online speech. I'm not going to criticise the police, and I'm not here to defend all of these social media posts, as some of them likely warranted further action. And to be clear, I love the UK. We share a lot of cultural similarities with our Commonwealth overlords, and our culture is in many ways downstream from theirs. Our policing practices differ, of course. In the UK, police routinely act on complaints, whereas the threshold for free expression in Australia is seemingly more rigid. But the devil is in the details. If Australia and the UK both allow bad faith politicians to equivocate criticisms of race with criticisms of ideas, we allow them to dictate our language for us. If we take the media reports at face value and allow them to propagate these nonsensical definitions in their reporting, we are at risk of these definitions being fast-tracked into dictionaries like Merriam-Webster. Despite all of this, dictionaries and media companies aren't inherently evil or political. They have financial motivations. They have a desire to remain relevant. But when Merriam-Webster capitulates, the culture changes. And whatever it is we had before will be different, and the next generation will be none the wiser.